It's like everything's coming together, man.
After more than 3 years living on the streets, it's moving day for Kyle.
I'm beyond excited. This is my angel. Oh, hey.
The King County Regional Homelessness Authority is making progress opening doors, but demand far exceeds supply.
We need more housing, need more treatment resources for folks.
All those in favor, please say aye.
And while the county is pushing for a regional route to solving homelessness, more suburban cities are passing public camping bans.
We're working together. We have different ideas.
It's a waste of resources.
How can the authority unify the county's 39 cities as it launches a new 5-year plan to end homelessness?
The voters have been clear. This is enough.
We check in with Marc Dones, the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority.
This really could be the model.
Turning up the heat on homelessness as the temperature drops outdoors. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. The King County Regional Homelessness Authority has gone through plenty of challenges since its launch in late 2019. It took more than a year to hire a CEO, and the authority's request to have its budget nearly doubled in 2023 has drawn criticism from a number of elected officials. But the agency says it's making progress, getting people out of unauthorized encampments and into housing, especially in downtown Seattle. This December, the KCHRA plans to release its 5-year plan to end homelessness in King County. And this week, we're looking at how close that goal truly is to becoming a reality.
Yeah, it's a good day to move, man.
Kyle Uecker is excited.
Here we go.
This 39-year-old, homeless for the past 3+ years and managing an addiction to painkillers, is moving out of a tent near T-Mobile Field.
This is my angel right here, man.
Yvonne Hernandez, also formerly homeless, is now a systems advocate for King County's Regional Homelessness Authority.
If you can push, yeah, and I'll pull.
He's moving Uecker into one of 310 housing units the RHA will pay a year's rent for through its landlord incentive program.
Well, I hate to see you go, but not really.
The RHA, using a by-name list
Later.
of nearly 800 homeless people in downtown Seattle, has 41 people matched up with housing and has fully moved in 13 others as of mid-November. A small but growing number that Kyle Uecker is just glad to be a part of.
It's been 3 years. It's been a long trip, long road. I reached the finish line, and I'm happy as can be.
But the journey for the RHA itself, established in late 2019, has not been an easy one.
You know, I think there's like a sense of compassion fatigue.
Joe Conniff, also formerly homeless, is co-director of the RHA's Systems Advocate Peer Navigation Team, who's well aware the county and city of Seattle declared a homelessness emergency more than 7 years ago.
For our housed residents and our unhoused residents, it's like, you know, have we seen a lot of progress on that?
In the midst of the pandemic, it took more than a year for the RHA to hire a chief executive officer. But since then, the agency has set up a housing command center to coordinate resources, a searchable online regional database of homelessness services, and a voucher program that's placed more than 1,100 people into housing, one of the best totals for such a program in the country.
The community is very receptive, particularly our unhoused neighbors. They're the ones that matter the most. And our team's out there and we're getting great response.
Now the RHA is trying to get local leaders to respond to a major budget increase request for 2023. The city of Seattle currently pays 2/3 of that bill.
We're very invested in the regional strategy working.
Andrew Lewis, head of the City Council's Homelessness Committee, is encouraged by the progress the RHA has made.
They are really firing on all cylinders and getting people out there in the community to get folks inside.
But in a tight budget year for the city itself, Seattle will add some, not all, the new funding the RHA is requesting. And the RHA will have less shelter space to work with in 2023. After King County's planned expansion of an existing 270-bed homeless shelter with services and case management was scrapped following an uproar from the Chinatown ID community, what Lewis calls a misunderstanding of a critically needed resource.
When we're talking about enhanced shelter, and there's people on site who will make sure the location is safe and secure. That doesn't really pose an issue to the surrounding community. And we, as leaders, we need to make that very clear.
But there's another message leaders outside of Seattle are making clear. They're taking a different approach to homelessness.
My residents would not be okay with a line of tents running down 4th Avenue. It just wouldn't work.
The RHA criticized Kent Mayor Dana Ralph for strengthening the city's ban on public camping this fall. But she says the law is intended to help people who are homeless, not put them in jail.
We want to get people connected with services, and we need to protect our environment.
Ralph has criticized King County's inability to deal with a massive unauthorized encampment just past the Kent border on unincorporated county land by the Green River that's existed for years.
All those in favor, please say aye.
While Ralph applauds the RHA's goals and its efforts to tailor different approaches to different areas of the county, she says parts of the regional response to homelessness have simply come up short.
We want to be collaborative and work together. We just know that what we're doing now isn't working.
I love you to death, man.
The system is working for Kyle Uecker, now employed, going through drug treatment, and with a caseworker who will be regularly checking in.
If he wants to get into basketball, if he wants to go in and sing, if he wants to get back to school, it's up to him. Like he said, he has a job right now, but the sky's the limit for him at this point.
The question now, what's the limit on our region's patience with the RHA? A new agency that's shown some promise, but still has far to go when it comes to shutting the door on homelessness.
It's nice meeting everybody. Peace out.
And here I am with Marc Dones, the CEO of the Regional Homelessness Authority. Marc, thank you very much for being here. And I wanted to talk about this. When I had you on the show last year at about the same time, you were just getting into the job, and you told me you thought of your position as bringing people together and bringing them along, meaning you're not leading by fiat. It's a collaborative process. You're trying to get a lot of people together to solve this complex problem of homelessness. So, easy question to start. How successful do you think you have been in that goal?
Well, one, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to be here in person and not virtually.
Yeah.
I think that we are seeing some pretty significant success. I think, we are, seeing a new ILA, interlocal agreement, wind its way through council votes in North King County, right? We saw, I think, our first vote pass 7-0, right? And so I think we are really beginning to have the conversations with jurisdictions across the county that are leading them to have faith, right? That this, again, will not be a dictatorial enterprise or something that is not going to take into account the very nuanced interests of communities of all 39 of our cities, right?
Right.
So I think it's going well. I think, you always want things to be faster than they are, right? But the doing good community work that's going to bring people along is better than speed that's going to cause things to break down.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to focus on something specific to downtown Seattle, because March of this year, you were talking with the Seattle City Council about this goal of functional zero homelessness in downtown Seattle. You said this was possible, I believe, by next year in 2023. And the Partnership for Zero, the philanthropic group, is going to be helping out with that. Please explain, if you could, what functional zero is and if that goal is still on track.
Yeah. So functional zero, it's a little bit of a wonky term that basically means that there are extremely low levels of unsheltered, street homelessness. There are details about that, but I'm not going to belabor those.
That's okay.
That's basically what it means,
okay.
right? So we got HUD technical assistance, or HUD TA, in order to launch this project. TA team was on site starting in September. We spent most of September, a little bit of October, doing a lot of process architecture. And I know that sounds, again, pretty wonky, but the system that my team inherited had sort of grown into doing things that frankly weren't our job. And we know, for example, that we need a strong behavioral health system. We know that we need a strong public safety system, right? Our job as sort of the emergency room for the county with regard to homelessness is really just to rapidly rehouse folks. Yeah. And so what we had to do was build out a process that was really just focused on doing three things: identifying eligible units, identifying eligible households, and then moving those households into those units, right? Mm-hmm. And that feels very simple, but I think, as we all know, if any of us have tried to rent, sometimes that's not as simple as we want it to be. So we really laid out that process architecture and then began to deploy a field team to do that work. And I feel like we're doing really well, to be honest. I think, so when I last looked at data earlier this week, I believe we had about 17 households that had moved in. Mm-hmm. We had another 26 households that were in the process of, beginning to identify a unit. They were applying for, putting in rental applications, that kind of stuff. We had about 114 households that were in the process of getting access to ID. Right, okay. That's the big barrier for a lot of our folks who've been chronically homeless and have lost a lot of their, identifying documents, birth certificates, that kind of stuff.
Not on paper, as they're often called.
Exactly, and you need that in order to get access to housing. And so to have 114 households really in that process, I think is quite positive. Mm-hmm. So, if our total number of folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness in the downtown core, again, when I looked earlier this week, was about 770. Mm-hmm. So to be within a month at about 115 households are in the process of getting key documents, I feel good about that work. Okay. And if we can hold that pace, I think that when we are having this conversation, hopefully end of summer next year, we'll be looking at a very different downtown.
Great. I wanted to talk about KCRHA's budget because 'tis the season right now in November. First off, that headline from last week, the Times called it a budget mistake for the authority. This assumption that $9.4 million in federal pandemic relief money would be available. Turns out these are one-time funds. They expire at the end of this year. So I know you've been working with Seattle and King County to try to shore up this difference here. What happened here? What's the solution? Yeah. What impact is this going to have on your work?
I think, one of the things I appreciated the article itself. The headline was a little bit more scare quotey, I think. Okay. So from my perspective, our team did identify that these were one-time funds. We know fund sources. We understand that. I think that there was some discussion over the course of the summer with the mayor's budget office about the impact of that lapse. Yeah. Ultimately, I think we collectively concluded that there was a need to ensure that some of those funds were going to be available for providers in 2023. Okay. And so we began to work on making that possible. And I think that the thing that I took a little bit of umbrage with was, I think the term in the headline was scramble. And I just don't think a 6-month process is a scramble.
You've been going through it for several months. Okay.
I think the scramble to me implies we found out about this in October, and that is not the case. I think we've had really productive conversation with Director Dingley in the mayor's office. Really great conversation with Budget Chair Mosqueda. Right. And the authority, has really been focused on identifying underspend that we could put towards this. And so, basically, since we had this initial conversation in the summer, we started monitoring our invoicing, so where are there pots of money that we don't think are going to be fully expended by the end of the year that we can put towards closing this gap, right? Yeah. And so by the end of last week, I think of the 9.4, we'd identified 8.8 million in underspend that we were going to be able to put forward to close the gap in 2023, and so are working with our council and city colleagues to then close the remainder. Okay. So that, I think, is how I would talk that through, and I think what that means is that the actual budget gap is actually only about, I think, $600,000?
Yeah, less than $1 million.
Right. So that is a very different discussion than, the authority and everyone is scrambling to find $10 million.
And I appreciate you clearing that up, because I wanted to talk about the budget a little more broadly with you here, because it appears that the KCRHA is not going to get all that it was asking for from the city council. And knowing that Seattle provides the majority of your funding, that's a big deal. I wanted to talk about that, what your budget's going to look like next year, and also, if you could, talk about about the push for accountability too? Reagan Dunn on the county council is saying we need financial performance audits for the KCRHA next year. Let's talk funding and accountability, please, Marc.
Sure. So, I think that when we proposed our budget in the spring, I was very clear at the time, this is a budget proposal, and most agencies get to do that kind of work, frankly, not in public.
Right.
And so it doesn't have the narrative of, oh, well, you didn't get what you wanted, that's a rebuke, right?
Okay.
And in reality, every agency director proposes a budget that is probably way outside of what is fundable, and then we work with our executives and our legislative partners to then, make what is possible against the balance of priorities that folks have.
Got it.
So, the fact that Mayor Harrell came in and I think proposed about a 13 or 14% increase over base funding. Similarly, I think, our county colleagues have looked at, adding some additional funding in ARPA. So it'll be one-time money, but it is additional funding, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is not the oh gosh, the authority put forward this transformational budget, didn't get any of it. That's not what happened, right?
Right.
We got what our authorizing environment would support. And I think that inside a record shortfall, inside potentially a rising inflation, we're teetering on will there or won't there be a recession?
Right.
So if that's the economic background and we're getting additional investment, I actually think that says that people do feel good about what we do and want to make sure that we can be successful in bringing our unhoused neighbors inside.
Thank you for breaking those pieces down, too. I wanted to talk about this 5-year strategic plan that you're hoping to come out with before the end of the year. It's talking about ending homelessness in our region, and I'm very excited to hear about it. Is there any sort of preview you can give us as to what you're going to say?
Yeah. I think it shouldn't surprise anyone that, a number of the things in the plan will focus on ending homelessness for certain populations. We're going to focus, I think, on youth and young adults. We're going to focus on families, and then really driving down the number of folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. That has to be our focus, right? I think that Seattleites and broadly, residents of King County have been very clear in their discussions with me directly and with our team, and I hear it certainly from our elected colleagues, right? We know that voters are concerned first and foremost about not seeing people who have to live outside, right? And I, from my perspective, I'm honestly less concerned about how they got to that position because, for me, it's apolitical, right? It is simply that the voters have been clear, this is enough. And so we really have to hear that and deliver on what folks are asking for. So I think that, we're going to really make it so essentially no kid sleeps outside, right? No youth, young adult homelessness, no children with families, right? And then driving down that population of what we call our single adults through our broader unsheltered work. I think the other thing that you'll see in the plan is a real focus on performance and system performance, right? I've been very clear, as I was when I wrote the initial audit in 2018, this system does not perform. And it is not because people are not good at their jobs. It is because the architecture of the system doesn't actually support them in doing their jobs. And so a lot of what we're going to be focused on, particularly through our rebid process in 2023, is taking something that feels a little bit like a Frankenstein, right? Where it's just well, why is that attached to that, right? And turning it into something that has a clearer and more holistic approach towards taking folks from that experience of unsheltered homelessness all the way into a position of being housed and doing it quickly. And that's, I think, the third thing that you'll really see is our orientation is absolutely going to be towards again, functioning as an emergency response. And so, I think that it is not appropriate for the answer to everything to always be, well, it's going to take us 15 years to house this person. There has to be some recognition, I think, in how we spend our money, that the idea that we're going to build our way out of this crisis over 20 years isn't that doesn't align, again, with what it's clear that voters are asking for, or even, from my perspective, with being maximally responsive to human dignity and suffering, right? Like, this is a humanitarian crisis, and we got to act like it.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on one piece in particular, if I could briefly with you here, emergency housing vouchers. For the reasons that you're about to tell me, I hope, this has been a very successful program here in King County. I wanted to figure this out. It sounds like WeRN reported it's doing twice as well as similar programs across the U.S. Why has this been successful? Where could this go from here? What happened with this?
I think the first reason, and really the biggest reason it's been successful, is unprecedented partnership. I think that, going back to what, we started this conversation with, the authority really wants to lead through partnership. We don't believe that doing things alone is the right way to get things done. And so we partnered very deeply with our housing authority colleagues, particularly, our King County and Seattle Housing Authority colleagues. And they were able, in turn, to do a lot of administrative work to make the process more seamless for folks. And then we executed over 80 MOUs with community-based organizations to generate referrals into the voucher program.
Memorandum of Understanding. Keep going.
Thank you.
Yep.
Government jargon.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
And but I think that that's the core. Is just all of this partnership really sort of wrapping around these 1,314 vouchers and saying this resource cannot go to waste in this community, not with a crisis of this scale. And so we really, really worked hard to make sure that folks who were experiencing unsheltered homelessness would have a person they could connect with who could help them fill out the application. That in turn, the housing authorities made it so that any application filled out on any housing authorities, letterhead, et cetera, right, would be accepted at anyone, right? So a lot of that work, I think, is why we've seen that success. And, I'm hopeful. Our housing authority colleagues and I actually had some discussion in D.C. last week, lifting this up to the Department of Housing and Urban Development and other legislators and saying, this really could be the model, right? A homelessness system and a housing system that aren't just finally talking to each other, but are working together. That could turn this around. The one other thing I'll add, just, because I think it's important for viewers to understand, is that we also did a lot of work to engage private landlords. And I think that is really a significant departure from where we have been in the homelessness space of, only relying on what we could access through public funding.
Got it. And also important to see the outreach workers that are there have the lived experience of homelessness too, and that's a big part of this. I need to move on to another piece here. Some concerns in the city of Kent. Switching gears here a little with you. They passed a law recently to strengthen the ban on public camping they have there. A number of cities around the county have done this. I wanted to talk about this. I know you meet with the city of Kent and talk about this and meet with the mayor down there, Dana Ralph. I did too. What are your thoughts about laws like that? How does that impact the work of the KCRHA? And what does it say about this relationship between the KCRHA and these cities that are outside of Seattle? Yeah.
So I will say I meet with Mayor Ralph every other week right now. We're trying to work with them on a project that we're pretty excited about. I will maintain, what I have said from the beginning, right? Like, as a policy position, I am not in favor of these kinds of, what we call criminalization activities, right? But I also think that, there's has to be room for nuance there. Many of our smaller communities, they don't have outreach staff, any of them, right? So we've got, for example, in looking at Auburn, another community that folks bring up consistently, right? Auburn just got to a place where they're able to fund 2 outreach positions, right? So there's not a lot. There's not a resource that is doing that connecting of people who are unsheltered with, either shelter or emergency housing, access in many of our communities. And so what is left is, police officers
all the time.
And having had conversation with a number of, folks in law enforcement across the county, I think they're well aware that they're not well positioned positioned to really solve homelessness, right? But what they're saying is, I don't, unless there is a law that tells me
right.
what my lane is,
yeah.
right?
I want to know where the guardrails are.
Yeah, then I don't really feel comfortable being engaged at all, right? And so I think for our jurisdictions that don't have that robust outreach, the creation of these ordinances often helps clarify for law enforcement, this is the role you need to play, right? Now, the authority is, again, working with all of these jurisdictions to say, we want to have a future where that's not the case, right? We want you to have outreach teams. We want you to have enough emergency housing or other shelter options in your jurisdiction so that, we are able to execute these appropriate connections to care. Yeah. And again, looking at the progress in North King County and in other jurisdictions, I feel like that's something that folks are behind.
Yeah. I need to wrap up with you. I wish we had some more time, Mark, because this has been a great conversation. But I did want to catch up with you with regard to this. Year to year, I've been able to talk about this with you, which has been great, and I can't wait to connect with you in a few months when it's going to be 2023. But I guess I'm wondering what you're going to be able to tell me next year at this time. Will that one point in time count be lower? I know it hit a record high last year. What are you expecting? Some thoughts about that to wrap up.
I don't think, next year we'll be talking about the point in time count. I think we'll be talking about downtown. And I think we'll be saying we do not see the same numbers around chronic homelessness in the downtown core. I think we'll be talking about continuing to resolve very large entrenched encampments, right? I'm working on another one right now in South County that I'm hoping to tee up for a resolution early next year that's got about 100 people living in it. That's the work that I think we'll be talking about next year, is continuing to lift up these moments that are to some degree proof of concept, right? That show that we really can do this. And the other thing that I think we'll talk about next year is how, again, we have restructured the system so that it's not that Frankenstein, but is coherent and makes sense and is an engine that can really be used to end homelessness in our region. So that the year after that, I think we'll be able to say, fingers crossed, right? We've ended homelessness for youth and young adults. We've ended it for families, right?
Right.
And we're really making significant progress on those strategic plans. Yeah. I will also say that, for the viewing public, if those things haven't come to pass, I won't have a problem saying that. And I won't have a problem talking about, what we ran into and what shifts we've made. I think that, one thing that I am committed to is always being transparent and making sure that folks understand that their public dollars are being used to the highest possible and best use.
Thank you very much. Marc Dones from the King County RHA, the CEO there. Thank you very much, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about regional homelessness? One person writes, maybe the KCHRA can demonstrate that they're actually being efficient in helping solve the homelessness crisis before more money is shoveled their way. Another says, it's not poverty, it's not addiction, it's not mental illness, it's not liberal policies. It's the availability/affordability of housing. We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next time, Seattle voters were narrowly split on whether to change how city leaders are elected, but overwhelmingly favored an alternate system called ranked choice voting. We take a closer look at how it's worked in other cities and what it will take to implement it here by 2027. That's on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.